Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Good evening and welcome. Today we are joined by researcher and former teacher Dr. Emily MacLeod to find out who aspires to be a teacher and why. So join us as we explore moving from the classroom into education research, what brings graduates to teaching, and the support that aspiring teachers need to succeed. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Sunday Late Show. Today you find me on the happy side of our Year 11 English exams and halfway through A-level exams. My Year 11 students have completed their 5 exam papers in literature and language, and our Year 13 students have started their A-levels and are about halfway through them now, drawing on the rhythm of revision, recreation and rest that they have built up as the evenings have got longer and lighter. Our younger students are continuing to immerse themselves in their reading books as their year-long daily reading project draws towards a resolution, and my Year 9 students have been studying some First World War poetry, conveniently timed to coincide with the history department having taken them to visit the battlefields of Belgium earlier this week. Elsewhere, the ground staff have been heroically striving to get the cricket pitches into a usable condition after months and months and months of rainfall have left much of North Yorkshire looking decidedly soggy. T.S. Eliot, of course, famously described April as the cruelest month in his modernist epic, The Wasteland. And there can be no doubt that playing cricket in single-figure temperatures under iron-grey skies with the wind whipping in straight off of the North Sea is not the most joyful introduction to English summer sports if you've just arrived in the country from a baking hot Spanish Easter vacation, especially if your first language is French and you've joined the school at the same time that everybody else is revising for the end-of-year examinations. Let's hope that June doesn't feel quite so April-like as May this year has done, because without some sunshine and a bit of warmth over the next few weeks, our cricketing fixture list is going to look distinctly anemic this summer. I've just started an MPQSL course with the Church of England and the Catholic Education Society, so I've been working through the assessed modules on how learning works and how teaching can be developed over the last few weeks. The combination of webinar lecture sessions and self-paced online study seems to be working quite well at the moment as I get to grips with the observations of Coe, Dunlosky, William, Willingham and others. Cognitive science ideas feature quite heavily on the course, but it is pleasing to see that the research on grouping, planning talk for learning, and more general discussion-based approaches in the classroom are being given a fair amount of airtime too. I hope schools are starting to move away from the idea that all subjects need to be experienced as a contrived blend of psychology, mathematics, and Kahoot tests. Certainly, the latest Ofsted English subject report seems to imply that schools have gone much too far down the road of allowing learning in English to be dominated by summative assessment and closely related tasks. But this is hardly surprising given the over-bloated nature of examinations in GCSE English language, where competence in reading and writing could be determined in a much more streamlined way, thereby making space for the apparently neglected speaking and listening skills that presently account for, wait for it, 0.00% of available marks on the English language qualification. In literature too, English departments could be given much greater freedom if they had more say over meaningful text choices and didn't have to spend quite so long teaching students to draw largely pointless comparisons between 2 plays or between 2 or more poems. It is in artificial comparison tasks of this nature that the need to teach to the test is at its most urgent, for these kinds of literary approaches exist barely anywhere other than on the GCSE exam papers that require them. As an undergraduate student of English literature, I think I wrote only one truly comparative essay on the whole degree. As a master's student of Irish literature, I didn't write a single one. Nor did this approach to close reading feature in my doctoral work, even when I was explicitly examining similarities and differences between novelists writing within the same genre. At some point, policymakers and assessment designers simply have to recognise that the more unnatural the work that they require students to produce in an exam room, the more likely it is that teachers will focus on training their students to meet those unnatural expectations. Why would teachers do otherwise when they are held responsible for the results that students secure in public examinations? If public bodies are genuinely concerned that speaking and listening skills are currently given insufficient classroom time, then give those skills a value in assessment terms that is literally more than zero. If public bodies are worried that too many students are being taught to the test, then perhaps make the assessment criteria more open-ended and less of a shopping list of performative procedures so that there is actually space for the individual imagination to make its presence known. And if test papers are doing too much of the development work for teachers of teenage readers, then simply take past papers out of the public domain altogether. I'm sure many of my peers would relish the prospect of teaching what they deem to be knowledge and skills that really matter in a dynamic and engaging English curriculum. This is, after all, why many of them went into teaching in the first place. Rather fittingly, therefore, the focus of tonight's show is on the topic of who aspires to become a teacher and why. So we'll be asking what factors draw young graduates to teaching and how does this aspiration emerge? Who does and who doesn't realise that aspiration as the journey through teacher training towards early career teaching unfolds? And what should the Department for Education, teacher training institutions and our school managers be doing to encourage and support aspiring teachers in opting for a career in teaching? So I'm pleased to say we are joined by Dr. Emily MacLeod, who will share with us the findings of her research work into the attractiveness of teaching as a career to young graduates. Emily is an honorary senior research fellow at UCL and a senior analyst at RAND Europe. She is a former teacher and is now an education researcher interested in young people's aspirations and trajectories, particularly in teaching and in STEM science subjects. Emily worked for 8 years on the Aspires research project, which we'll hear more about later, and her PhD research into why young people do and do not become teachers recently won the Doctoral Thesis Award from BERA, the British Educational Research Association. Emily also has an interest in using research to inform policy and has worked on the House of Commons Education Select Committee. And I'm delighted to say that Emily joins us on the line now. Good evening to you, Emily, and thank you for joining us on Teachers Talk Radio today.
Good evening, Christopher. It's great to be here and thank you for the introduction. And most importantly, can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear. Perfect. Thank you very much. Perhaps it might be fitting to start, Emily, then, with the former teacher part of your academic biography that I've just summarised. What's the story there?
Yeah, so I wasn't one of those people who always planned to become a teacher, always thought I would become a teacher. And my first degree was actually in law and French. And during that degree, I kind of I found it interesting, but I wasn't too fussed about going to work in the law. And while I was in the last year of my degree, I was thinking about, do I actually want to work in the law? And that's when I learnt about Teach First, which seemed a great way, enabled me to be able to work straight away, earn money straight away, and also get qualifications straight away. So yeah, that's what led me into teaching and what started my career in education research.
And how was the experience of Teach First? It's recently gone through a rebrand, I think.
Yeah, I had a really great time of it. I can only say good things, but I know that it like the name itself is not ideal. I think in some ways, thinking about teacher supply, like we're going to be speaking about tonight. I think I had quite an unusual experience of Teach First, in that I worked in a brand new school in Hull. Which meant that, unlike perhaps lots of early career teachers' experiences, and they're the only a new person in their school, there was actually quite a lot of us all at once, which I had a really great experience of. Um, but yeah, I really liked the fact that you were learning both the practical side of teaching and the theoretical side at the same time. Yeah, it was a really great experience for me. But working in a brand new school definitely had its challenges.
And what would you say those were?
So the school was very ambitious that I worked in, because it had taken over a new school and there were lots of us new staff. There was a focus on project-based learning at first, which is really cool and really innovative, and has lots of like research in the US, but I think had at least this was like 10, 15 years ago, had been done less in the UK. And I think in reality, it was quite difficult to marry those project-based learning, where in theory you're meant to like be able to combine lots of subjects and work long term towards one big project. It was quite hard to fit into the timetabled system, and kind of this box ticking that you mentioned in your introduction that we sometimes have in education. Yeah, so that wasn't always easy. But we also had, there was a school down the road that traditionally took a lot of students who had English as an additional language in the city, that closed down after I'd been in the school for a year. So our intake changed quite dramatically, like overnight, really. But as a language teacher, as a French teacher, that was a really positive experience for me, because it meant that those students who sometimes struggled in other subjects, at least at first, because perhaps their English wasn't as high, and that therefore they all couldn't always access the curriculum immediately. In French, it was great because everyone has the same starting block, they were all starting from the same place. So I really enjoyed teaching a variety of students there. Yeah.
And what kind of take up of French was there in East Yorkshire? Because you were teaching in Hull, weren't you?
Yes, yeah. So yeah, not too far from where you are. Um, I think so. I There wasn't a sixth form in my school, so I don't have a really good grasp of that. But I really found that the students loved French and like loved the subject. It often came from occasionally other teachers, or sometimes family members of students, who thought, "Hang on, why do you need French?" And I think that was why one of my favorite moments of my whole teaching career was, I organized a couple of times a day trip to France. So yes, you heard me right. It was a day trip from Hull. So it was a really long day, but like 24 hours. So we'd meet once a year in the car park, like late in the evening after the school day. And then we drove down to Boulogne-sur-Mer, which is not too far from Calais, and we'd spend the day in Calais. And that I really loved, because it was fairly cheap and fairly accessible for a lot of the students, but it was also a great way to like bring French to life, which obviously is really hard to do sometimes as a languages teacher in the north of England. And one of my favorite things that I did there was, I gave every student every time a €5 note, so they can go and order their own breakfast in the morning from the boulangerie, which of course just like introduces kids to croissants and pain au chocolat if they've not had them before. So I really enjoyed that experience. But yeah, I think day to day French, it was sometimes just a bit like unsure, like you didn't come across it in your everyday life. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? Of course, because Hull is an international major shipping port. But I think most of the things that come into it are cargo now rather than passengers, although there are still some passenger vessels that go off, I think, to France and to Belgium and Holland.
Yeah, you're right. It is definitely still a port, but I think very few, much fewer people now who live in the city work in that industry. And yeah, like I saw some of the difficulties that that meant in terms of like the local economy and the workforce. But yeah, it could be quite a global city, but it didn't always feel like that, because yeah, like in one side of the city, it doesn't always feel close, like to the local ports.
So you're enjoying yourself then, introducing children to the wonders of the French patisserie and enjoying your time in this new school. What was it that caused you to leave teaching then, Emily?
Yeah, really good question, and one that I have thought about a lot, because of my own research since. So it wasn't something that I planned, or like I was like, this is, the year I'm leaving teaching. Um, but I had done a master's in education while I was teaching, and I absolutely loved the research side of it. I really enjoyed getting to know the like a bit more like you do in your PGCE, but getting to know some of the, for example, the research behind the inequalities I was seeing. I mentioned that I was teaching a lot of students who had English as an additional language, really understanding some of the evidence behind the experiences that my pupils were going through, and how they experienced education. And I think it's a tale as old as time. My partner was moving for his work, and so I was looking to move. And because I'd just finished the master's, I thought, hang on, can you work in education research? And at the time, I didn't know if you could and what that would look like. But I was lucky enough to find a job. At the time, it was at King's College London, on a research project. And yeah, I didn't really know if you could work at a university and what that looked like, but I was very lucky because the project that I worked on, that you mentioned in your introduction, yeah, I ended up working on it for 8 years, and it's a really fascinating long-term study into education research. So yeah, I haven't taught in a classroom, like a school classroom since, but yeah, I still think of myself as a teacher, as I'm sure a lot of us do who've left the classroom. Yeah.
And what was it like moving into university teaching after having not had much or potentially any experience of working at that A level transition point?
Yeah, good question. Absolutely. So I'd done some like small scale like teacher workshops while I was a teacher, and that really I think taught me some important differences between teaching adults compared to teaching in schools. I think the first one is, which I think is super applicable to the classroom too, where it's possible. I remember someone saying to me once, if someone doesn't talk in the first sort of 5 minutes of a workshop or a session or a seminar, then they're more likely to stay quiet for the rest of it. And I kind of bring that into my university teaching. But as I say, I think that's probably applicable to a classroom where it's possible, like get everyone talking and engaging as quick as they can. And the other main difference I would say is that in education, like courses at higher education, I'm teaching people who are teachers, were teachers, work in education charities, work in the civil service, and they bring with them such a wealth of experience, that's different from my own and different from other lecturers and other tutors, that is so relevant to a lot of what we discuss. So, for example, I taught on a research methods module, and I taught on a module more on the sociology of education and sociology of race. And the experiences that people bring from their own careers are really important and really rich. And I always make sure that I take the time to allow students to share their experiences in a way that unfortunately we don't always have time for in the classroom setting. Yeah.
Thank you. And in terms of this Aspires project that you've mentioned, what role did that play in shaping your education research? And could you explain a little bit about the project for us?
Yeah, thank you. So Aspires is so it's now at UCL, And it's a really cool project that tracks young people's career aspirations and their trajectories into different careers over a long period of time. And it's specifically interested in young people's experiences of education and their aspirations in science, but it is also quite broad. So the project started when the cohort of young people were 10, and that same cohort is now 24. And I joined when they were about 15. So it's really cool in that it's a longitudinal study and we're able to track those aspirations and experiences over time. And the other cool thing about it is that it's mixed methods. So, as someone who came straight from the classroom, I was able to learn about lots of different methods all at once. So, roughly every 2 years on the project, we surveyed that cohort of young people, asked them what they wanted to do when they were older, and also understood like what's your experience of education, like why do you have certain attitudes towards education, and trying to really understand that. But we also had a qualitative element which gave that real in-depth data to accompany our statistical data. And there we surveyed a cohort of young people and their parents separately, again about every 2 years, asking similar questions like, what do you want to be when you're older? Why is that? Like, how's school going? What kind of things might you want to do to like help you achieve those goals? And that was a really fascinating way to like learn about research and education research and not just read it like I had on my master's course. But the other thing that I think was important about that experience is that it taught me more fully about the inequities and inequalities we have in education. So, because the project was focused on science and young people's experiences of science and their aspirations towards science, um, we really focused on how does gender and ethnicity and social class pattern at those aspirations. And of course they really do in this country and in many other countries, and tried to understand, oh hang on, is it not that, for example, girls don't aspire to science? It's perhaps sometimes the case that science doesn't make space for girls, or the systemic structures around science perhaps prevent girls from seeing themselves as fitting in within science. And that really was useful in terms of helping me to understand the sociology of education, which is, yeah, how I came to do my own research and my own PhD, which used some of the Aspires data.
Yeah, there's certainly been quite a significant amount of time and money invested into promoting particularly physics for girls in the last 10 years. Did your study register any of those kinds of initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, you've perhaps reminded me of another important thing about the project, which, because it's such a big project, it's got really good links with a lot of what I would call broadly like policy and practice partners. So they might be learned societies like the Institute of Physics, but also schools and also policymakers. So we've got such rich and big data sets on the project that we were able to yeah, exactly, like you said, try to understand why is it that girls don't go into physics. And it's not the case that they don't enjoy it, but also we one of the interesting factors around that in particular was that it's that girls in physics often feel the need to adapt their identities to fit in with the world of physics, sorry. So perhaps their feminine sides of their identities aren't celebrated in physics. And in some cases, that might mean that they feel pushed out, or they feel the need to leave the subject or opt out of it. Whereas some girls had it within their like wishes, and had the support to be like, oh, I've just like changed myself a little bit, which is really sad. But yeah, it just, I think, exemplifies those structural barriers that there are. It's not the young people, in this case the girls, who need to change. We need to think more broadly about what I would call the field or the sector of science. How can it be more welcoming to those young people? But yeah, I think that kind of taught me that I know that some people think about university as research for research's sake, lots of people in stuffy offices writing papers that people don't read. But because we had those links on the Aspires project, I learnt really early on that research can make a difference and can have an impact in the real world, which is really important to me.
And what was the actual start time for the data collection? So if I'm thinking about these people as 15-year-olds, when were they 15?
Oh, yeah. So we started when they were 10, and that was in 2009. So they've almost got the same age as the end of year. So now it's 2024, and they're about 23 at the moment, I think. Yeah. So I think that's also really interesting about that data set and that cohort, because that if you were to do it again and start this whole process again, these young people would be living through something else, right? A different government with different politics and policies, but also, of course, the pandemic. And there are a lot of things that influence these structures, but also how people feel within these structures. So I think that it's a really fascinating project, and it's really great that it's been able to continue on for so long, because we get to investigate some of the impacts of some of the things that they've lived through.
Well, that's great. That's really set us up nicely, Emily, for the next part of the show. It's really good to hear about your insight into your classroom experience, beginning in the school and then moving into the university environment. And quite good to hear as well the significant factors that had influenced your research stemming from that Aspires project, which seems to me to be a very considerable resource to work with in terms of working through where people think they would want to be in 10 years' time and whether the classroom would be part of that voyage for them. We're going to look at some more specific findings of your research into what makes teachers wish to go into the profession. And we'll begin to explore some of those after this.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Reading Solutions UK. Are you looking for best practices and innovative strategies to foster confident, lifelong readers? Join the free online International Reading Conference on the 11th, 12th and 13th of June. Hear from speakers like TV personality and education expert Basit Siddiqui, beloved children's author Michael Rosen, fluency expert Tim Rosinski, EEF specialist Chloe Butlin, the National Literacy Trust's Irene Picton, and a range of experienced practitioners, including MATS leaders, deputy heads, heads of English, high-level teaching assistants, and school librarians. Through the 3-day conference, speakers will explore a range of topics at the forefront of the current educational landscape, with sessions relevant for all educators and key stages. Visit Reading Solutions at readingsolutionsuk.co.uk for more information and to sign up for this free conference.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
According to FE Week, Sir Ian Buckham, the interim head of exams regulator Ofqual, is Gillian Keegan's preferred candidate to take on the role permanently. The role of chief regulator will only be confirmed by whoever forms the next government. The current Education Secretary chose to appoint an interim chief regulator for a year after Dr. Joe Saxton stepped down to head up UCAS. Sir Ian began the role in January, and Ms Keegan has put him forward for the full-time role, following approval from the Prime Minister. However, Sir Ian's pre-appointment hearing with the Parliamentary Education Committee will not take place until after the recently announced general election on July the 4th. it leaves a potential new government facing the decision on whether to keep the current Conservative-approved candidate or find an alternative. The Indian Business Standard News website explores the reasons for a drop in numbers of Indian students choosing the UK as their higher education destination. 21,000 fewer master's degree applicants have registered than in previous years, according to official figures. Anuj Gupta, CEO of Young Rads, said that Indian students are now hesitant to apply due to stricter visa regulations. Gupta went on to point out the financial impact this could have on UK institutions, as they rely heavily on tuition from international students. The article goes on to suggest that the British government has prioritised curbing migration over university student numbers. The article goes on to point out that many Indian students are now considering countries like Germany, which offers a combination of world-class universities, minimal tuition fees, and a low visa rejection rate. In Wales, the BBC reports again on measures some head teachers are taking to save cash as budget squeezes continue. A primary head teacher in Pembrokeshire is reported to be moonlighting as his school's caretaker, seeing to day-to-day maintenance, testing fire alarms and water hygiene, alongside teaching and headship itself. Many other schools are responding by cutting jobs. According to the report, the Welsh Government said its budget was £700 million less in real terms than when it was set by the UK Government in 2021. Councils have confirmed to BBC Wales News that nearly 200 schools have been discussing redundancies in 2024, with cuts largely directed to welfare and support services in schools. The BBC also reports on an open letter sent by head teachers from schools across St Albans to parents. The letter calls on parents not to let their children have a smartphone before they are 14. St Albans Primary Schools Consortium urged parents to wait until Year 9 at secondary school before giving them a device. In it, the letter talks of how the devices could expose children to a number of risks, and that whilst it was understandable that phones could give parents peace of mind, children's phones do not need to have access to the internet in order for you to keep them safe. TeacherTapp's survey tool published data last January that suggested only 1% of schools had no restrictions in place at all on phones in schools. But the topic remains a cause for concern, especially as smartphones are now a feature of daily life for most adults, and that some children as young as Year 1 have access to such a device. Finally, a West Yorkshire MP is calling for children to be taught about endometriosis in schools. The condition, which can cause chronic pain, affects about 1.5 million women in the UK, according to figures from charity Endometriosis UK. MP Sir Alex Shelbrooke said he had been shocked by the lack of education surrounding the condition. The Department for Education said new RSHE curriculum proposals included the addition of lessons on menstrual and gynecological health, including endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome, and heavy menstrual bleeding. Sir Alex said both girls and boys should learn about all aspects of reproductive health. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Welcome back to our show on aspiring teachers and their motivations for wanting to enter the profession with Dr. Emily MacLeod. In the first section of the show, we explored some of Emily's own experiences of teaching in the secondary classroom and the university seminar room. Now I'd like us to move on to consider some of the findings of Emily's research into aspiring teachers in a little more detail. So, you've talked about how you moved into education research at university, Emily, and the significance of the Aspires project for supporting that. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about how those particular findings led into the building of your own research project?
Yeah, thank you, Christopher. So I mentioned that Aspires is this really longitudinal project with such a lot of data. So to date, we've surveyed over 70,000 young people, and we've tracked 50 young people, and I think something like 700 interviews qualitatively to understand what they want to be when they're older. And the nature of university working, unfortunately, is that my contract on the project came to an end towards the end of 2019. But it's such a great data set, really unusual that it's longitudinal, and a really great team of people. So I wanted to see if I could use that data in a new way. And as a former teacher, I'm very aware that I am, as I say, as you've mentioned, like former teacher, and that is an issue in terms of we know that there are such awful teacher shortages in England and in many other countries, and that we desperately need to understand how we can recruit more teachers and keep more teachers in the profession. So I knew the data set from Aspires, and I hope to be able to use that data to kind of answer some new questions. And I was really lucky to be able to get funding from the Economic and Social Research Council, as well as the Royal Society of Chemistry, to be able to do my PhD, which meant that it was a full-time job for 3 years. And it was with the Aspires data, and I also collected some of my own data from some of the young people from the study as well. So instead of asking, like, why do some of them aspire to science or other STEM subjects and why that is, I kind of generated some new research questions that I knew the data would help me to answer, which was, why do young people aspire to teach and who are they? But also, because I was lucky enough to be starting my PhD at the same time that these young people were kind of emerging into their adulthood, they were early 20s and they were starting their first careers, whether or not that was whether they went to higher education or not. I was also able to ask whether those people who said that they aspired to teach then went on to teach, and why that was that they became a teacher or didn't. Yeah.
So in terms of those questions then, Emily, how many young people are interested in teaching according to the figures that you looked at?
Great question. So I first looked at that first question, like, who aspires to teach, who are they, how many of them are there? And I had some really unusual, I think, and surprising findings. So I used the survey data from Aspires and did some secondary analyses of them. And I found, first of all, that about 5% of young people at every age we surveyed, so that's from age 10 up to age 22, said that they wanted to become a teacher when we asked them to type into a box, like, what job do you want? So that 5% really surprised me. It was quite a lot, and I thought, that 5%, that they can't all be going into teaching. I wonder what's happening there. And so to try and understand that finding a bit more, I did another piece of statistical analysis with that data, and we asked another question in the survey that was asked to about 60,000 young people, again over this period of from age 10 to 22, and we asked, to what extent would you agree with the statement, I would like to be a teacher? And I was really surprised to find that a third of young people at all surveys, and this is 6 surveys over that 11-year period, a third of young people agreed that they would like to be a teacher. And I found that really shocking and surprising and promising all at once, because we know that those statistics aren't translating into recruitment rates, right? So if all of those people who agreed that they would like to be a teacher were becoming a teacher, we wouldn't have this problem of teacher shortages. So on one hand, it's really great news, but on the other hand, because it doesn't translate into recruitment, the question is, what's happening there? Why are so many interested in it but not going into it? And so through some qualitative analyses I had, which is through the interviews that we had with young people and their parents, again over that 11-year period, I was able to dig a little bit deeper into that question. And briefly, I found that it's because teaching is very common as a second choice career or as a backup career. And perhaps that's not surprising. And I think that it's something that other people discuss and write about. But it's promising in a way, I think, that so many people aren't against teaching, but it's perhaps not the thing that they want to try first of all, that it's something in the back of their minds. Yeah.
That's an interesting finding, because it kind of coincides with my own experience, actually, of going into teaching. Having come from a family where my mother is a teacher and various of her sisters are teachers, and going a little bit further back in the family tree, teachers as well, it seemed to me that it was something I was quite keen I didn't want to do when I was kind of 14, 15, 16, because I saw the amount of work and effort and time that was going into it, and I thought, actually, I'd perhaps like some evenings to myself every now and again.
Yeah.
And don't really want to be surrounded by lots and lots of noisy little people. But I suppose your views on those change over time. What kind of other reasons were people giving in your qualitative research?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say that I was really lucky, and it's really unusual to have this qualitative data that spans 11 years. So what I did with the qualitative data was I chose 13 young people who'd been tracked over the course of the Aspires project, all of whom had mentioned at some point that they might want to become a teacher. And so what I called them potential future teachers. They all had an aspiration to teach at some point. And this is really unusual, because even though teacher shortages are widely known as a big societal problem, and a lot of people are researching them, and we all want to try and find out how can we get more teachers, a lot of the research that exists at the moment is surveys, typically with people who are already teaching. Either they're already working in the classroom, or they're pre-service teachers, so people who are teacher education students. And these surveys ask them, why did you want to become a teacher? Why have you joined the profession? And that research is really interesting, because it tells us, for example, that lots of teachers chose to teach because they want to work with children, or because they enjoyed their subject. Which I think was like partly the case with myself, and maybe you as well. But it's what I call one-sided, and also one-off. So it's one-sided in the fact that it only asks those people who decided to teach. So what about the people who don't? And it's also one-off in that it asks them at one point in time. And so by using the Aspires data, I was able to kind of address those gaps that we have in the literature, because it's longitudinal, it goes over time, but also I was able to track people who then realized those aspirations, but also dropped them. So to go back to your question, I found overall that what was common about those 13 young people was that they had really messy, complex, like what I call trajectories towards and away from teaching. Nothing was straightforward, and there were lots of different reasons for why they aspired to teach, and then why they did and didn't become teachers. And when I was trying to make sense of like what's common amongst these people, I found that actually at the time that they aspired to teach, all figured teaching as something that was high in status and also high in safety. So we hear status a lot about teaching, and sometimes it's mentioned in quite a negative way. We hear that teaching can be low in status, but I found that all of these 13 young people at some point thought that teaching was high in status, by which I mean that it's a job where you can do good and help other people. It's a profession where you're benefiting others. And high in safety, I kind of coined to make sense of the fact that for all of these young people, it was important in their decision making that teaching felt accessible to them, and it was something that they could do, like it was an accessible route, and that it offered them a decent lifestyle. And in terms of whether and why the young people then realized their aspirations or dropped or abandoned those teaching aspirations, those themes of status and safety really helped me, because it was the people who maintained teaching as high in status and high in safety who then became teachers, whereas those people who didn't become teachers, either the status or safety of teaching was lost over time.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you if you'd noticed any pattern in perhaps perceptions of safety or status in the profession rising as your young people pass particularly significant milestones like GCSE examinations at 16, A-level examinations at 18? I wondered whether their view of teachers rose as they came through A-levels, because I'm used to seeing every year A-level students suddenly realising, actually, this person who's been, reminding me I'm supposed to wear the school uniform properly and not jump the dinner queue is actually on my side and is helping me set myself up for life after school. Was there any sense of that in the figures at all?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I think you raise an important point, which is I found that status and safety were changeable, they were relative, they were transitory, and often, especially the word status, it's kind of a label that we put on things, that that's high in status, that's low in status, whereas this wasn't the case in the way that I found it. It changed, like you said, according to age, but actually most significantly, it often changed or kind of was something that kind of altered a little bit in accordance with young people's gender, ethnicity, social class. But to go back to your question about age, in fact, that was quite another interesting finding from my survey analysis, which is that this high proportion of young people who said that they were open to teaching, this 1/3 of young people, that was across all ages. So that included young people in primary school, in early secondary school, mid and late secondary school, but also once they'd left secondary school and were 18, 19, so perhaps in further education or perhaps in higher educational work. And I think that was really interesting because we do hear a lot, and we hear, and I've certainly read a lot of people say, oh, perhaps lots of young people want to become teachers because that's what they see every day. They go to school, there are teachers in front of them, that's what makes them want to teach. And it's said often in quite a derogatory way, but I think my findings evidence that even if that is the case, that young people are interested in teaching because they see teachers a lot, it seems to be a lasting impact. It wasn't, or it didn't dip off, or it didn't increase. It was really quite stable. It was really close to 1/3 at all of those ages surveyed. So even though I definitely know what you mean and have experienced it myself, I think one thing to say is it's hard to know are these the same young people? Is it always the same third? And that's something that wasn't able to be analysed using the data set that I had. But I think it's still really interesting and important that such a high proportion of young people are open to teaching. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if there's something going on there too about the closer they get towards adulthood, the more comfortable they feel expressing that sentiment, whereas it might be something they kept hidden perhaps when they were younger from the people teaching and from their peers perhaps.
Yeah, I think you absolutely might be right. I think this is something that is again linked with gender and ethnicity and social class. So it was definitely across both the survey data and the interview data, it was often white women who were the most likely to report that they aspired to teach. And while that isn't a problem in itself, I think when I last checked, this was probably last year, but I imagine it's very similar now. 75% of our teaching workforce in England identify as women, and 85% identify as white British. And I think that this is something that is often missing from our discussions about the teacher shortages we face here in England. It's really important that we try and get more people into the profession, but I also think that we need to remember that these shortages are patterned by gender, patterned by ethnicity. And I think that some of the ways that we can seek to recruit more teachers might usefully kind of consider these questions. It's great that white women want to teach, but why is that? And is it that other people don't want to teach, or is it that there are perhaps barriers to becoming a teacher for them?
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make there, because in your study, 3 out of a possible 50 teachers who became teachers, all of those were white women, weren't they?
Yes, yeah. I knew that would potentially happen because of what we just said, right? Most teachers in England are white women, but I think that was really interesting that it kind of came to light in that way. And in terms of why they taught, I kind of I looked and analyzed in depth this longitudinal data I had for all of them. And what was really interesting was that they all, once they were in teacher education, implied that teaching was something that was always going to happen for them. They were always going to become a teacher. Even perhaps that teaching was their calling, or that they were born teachers. And this all fits into this discourse that we have, that teaching is a vocation, right? And that's quite common, and we hear that quite a lot in everyday life. Though what was particularly interesting for me is that I had the benefit or the complexity of having their longitudinal interview data. So actually I knew that wasn't the case for any of them. And in fact, what they all had in common was they had, like I mentioned briefly earlier, they had very messy and complex and what I would call multi-directional journeys towards becoming a teacher. It wasn't this linear, automatic thing that was always going to happen, like they kind of implied once they were in teacher education. So, for example, even though most of the three of them, they did all say that they wanted to teach at different points in their education. One of them worked quite hard to find a different teaching route to the one that she had planned, because the pandemic meant that the funding was cut to becoming a primary school teacher in the way that she wanted. So she had to do quite a lot of research and make some compromises in terms of how far she was willing to travel to become a teacher. Another one wanted to live independently, as she had done at university, but then because of the cost of becoming a teacher, she had to make the sacrifice to go and live at home again. And another one struggled quite a lot in her college and higher education experiences, and she felt that she perhaps wasn't clever enough to be a teacher, and she did quite a lot of work to kind of prove herself and to other people, to show that she was clever enough to be a teacher and she could be a teacher. But all of that to say, they all worked really hard and made some sacrifices and made some compromises to become a teacher. But then once they got there, they kind of didn't tell that story. And on one hand, I think we all do that, right? We make sense of our experiences and give this narrative of, oh, that was meant to happen. But I think it's really interesting, given that we have this discourse that teaching can be a vocation for some.
Yeah, certainly. It's an interesting narrative. It's one we've heard frequently in various places. Certainly in Western society, we tend to see the teacher as being kind of called on some mission to go into the classroom because, the pay is not particularly great. Did any of your people make that point?
Yeah, I think basically it's quite problematic, this notion of a vocation, because yes, it's perhaps an excuse for being less well paid than it could be, and compared to other professions. And I also think it does a disservice because it doesn't acknowledge this hard work that people do to become a teacher. One of the kind of key things that I try to shout about, having done this research, is to remind people that teaching is a skilled, educated profession. Everyone in it has done a lot of qualifications and a lot of study and a lot of hard work, and has a lot of experience to be able to get there. It's not something that you're born with and you can just do automatically. And the second thing I'd say on that is that, going back to your first point, that all of these three young people who kind of shared this narrative were white women. And I think that does raise the question as to whether other people who don't share those intersectional identities maybe perhaps they don't share that view as much? And is it perhaps that young people who don't identify as white women maybe aren't being told by parents or family members or their own teachers as often, oh, do you know, you'd make a good teacher, you're great with your younger siblings, or you do this great volunteer work, do you know you can be a teacher? And my research indicates that that messaging is happening a lot with white women, but perhaps it's happening less so with others. And why is that? And perhaps we should think about that more.
Yeah, it's a good point to raise. I was thinking too, as you were talking through your answer there, of the question of economic investment, because it is now quite a significant economic investment to train to become a teacher, just to get through the PGCE phase and then the first job in the first school. Was finance a factor for any of your interviewees?
Yeah, definitely. And I completely agree with you. It is messy. And as I mentioned in my own teaching trajectory, the big appeal of Teach First was that it paid me, right, rather than me having to pay for my PGCE. So yeah, I said that one of my participants was able to return and live at home while she was doing her teacher education, and that was her PGCE. And that, as I mentioned, was something that she didn't originally want to do, wasn't super keen on. She had two very young brothers that she had to live with while teaching, which I think must have been quite a busy household, and perhaps wasn't as quiet as you might ideally want when you come home from a busy day at school as an early career teacher. So her sacrifice was, she was able to make it work financially, but she had to live at home. Another of my participants actually did a lot of research to find a school. This was through School Direct, who had actually, I think this must be a very unusual circumstance, the school had found a pot of money in their own budget to support young people through School or young early career teachers through School Direct, so that if you did Schools Direct with them, they'd give you on a bursary of, I think it was £2,000, and that for this participant made it. It was her, what I might call her teacher maker in that scenario. She knew that she couldn't afford to live where she lived and pay for teacher education, but this £2,000 it only existed in this school. I've not heard about it being like a wide policy. It's just that this school was unusual, that it had some money, and this is how they chose to spend it. So that really influenced her. And my third young person, again, like really, she made it work. She was living with her partner during her teacher education. This was someone on a skit. And actually, while she was making it work and she was supported by her partner, she was telling me this was in London. She was doing her teacher education. Partway through, she was having to sell her car, which meant that her journey to her placement school was going to change from being something like a 10-20 minute drive to over an hour on public transport, because she could no longer afford to run her car because of the investment that teacher education is. So I think that although what we sometimes call low pay of teaching didn't put off these young people, I definitely saw how individually they were really struggling financially, and they made it work because they were working hard to make it work, and they wanted to be teachers. But I think that, it must be putting off a lot of people as well. They had a lot of negotiations to do in order to get there, and I assume that lots of people aren't able to make those negotiations work.
Thank you. That gives us a really good sense, I think, of some of the challenges that your research participants were able to overcome to get into teaching. What about those people who didn't become teachers in your research, Emily? What did you find out about why they didn't make it? Were they set against teaching by some kind of event, or was it more complicated than that?
Really good question. I think this is like the juicy one, right? So I think I would say that no, they it wasn't that they were dead set against teaching at all, which reflects this idea that teaching is common as a backup career or a second choice, but also their decision was never definite. I kind of labelled them as non-teachers or people who had decided not to teach. And when I spoke with them, they were like, oh, well, I'm trying this other route, or I've got this other job, but, maybe I'll teach in the future, which who knows, that will require future research. But I think promising on one way, though, as we've just discussed, it's quite difficult and expensive to make teacher education work in some circumstances. So yeah, none of them were against it. And it actually, in terms of why they weren't teaching, came back to this status and safety. And actually, I should say that there were 10 young people who I looked at in depth in this kind of batch, and 3 of them had actually applied to be teachers. 2 of them had decided to withdraw their application after they'd been invited to interview, and 1 of them had their application rejected. And what was interesting about that is it's a good example of the safety of teaching was lost. So this was someone with a physics degree who was interested in being a physics teacher. And he'd mentioned it throughout his education. I think as soon as he started secondary school, it was something that he was thinking about along with other careers. And again, during his higher education, he was kind of interested in teaching, thought about some other things, but it was the safety of teaching that really drew him. He thought it would be very accessible to him. He thought he had what he needed to get onto a teacher education course, which was a physics degree. And then actually, because his teacher education application was rejected, and of course I don't know the ins and outs of why that was, but what I found particularly interesting is that his response to that was not, oh, I'll try again next year, but it was a complete turn away from teaching, for now at least. And this was someone who was working as a cleaner after he'd graduated from his degree. He didn't want to be working as a cleaner. He wanted to be able to use his science degree. But being rejected from teacher education meant that it was no longer safe for him. And I had other people who, for whom teaching became less high in status, and that was a bit more complex, and it was often linked with social class. So we've talked a little bit about money and pay, and that had a little part in it, I think, but more specifically, especially for those people who came from middle class backgrounds and had science degrees, it was kind of expected of them, often through their institutions and or their family, that they would do postgraduate degrees in science. And becoming a teacher wasn't always seen as something that required postgraduate degree, even though it does. People weren't always aware of that, and they thought, well, why would I then become a teacher but I won't have this master's degree or this PhD that I have access to? And that's how teaching was lost its status for some of the young people. Yeah.
Thanks. It's quite interesting to hear about those stories there. What lessons does the research tell us, do you think, about how young teachers view themselves then and the wider teaching profession?
I think in some ways it's really promising. It's not that young people don't want to teach, which I think could be something that you could interpret knowing the dire recruitment statistics that we have right now in England. But in other ways, it's very negative. And I think there it's the question of, why is teaching a backup or a second choice option, and how can we make it more of a first choice option? I think that, or a first choice career trajectory, I think that that's really the crux of how we need to how this research can be used, and those discussions that I want to have going forward. Yeah.
Am I right in saying your research was focused purely in England?
So the vast majority of my research has, because the Aspires project was focused in England, but during my PhD I was lucky enough to get funding to do a short research project in Canada, where I looked at young people who had science degrees or were doing a science degree, so science undergraduates, or in Canadian parlance, science majors. And I looked at young people who were doing a science degree and volunteering as some kind of in a teacher-like role, so people who, for example, were sports coaches or babysitters or volunteering at schools, to try and understand, oh, hang on, these are people who presumably could be science teachers. They have the necessary qualifications and they seem to have relevant work experience. And I use that to understand, do they see themselves as potential teachers? Are they interested in teaching? And is that different across Canada and England? Because in England, at least, we know Canada is somewhere that doesn't face the same teacher shortages as us. But actually, I found it was very similar there. And for science, across those two contexts, the big kind of headline finding was that the world of science is seen very differently and, in fact, completely separate from the world of teaching. And becoming a science teacher isn't this kind of merge or Venn diagram of these two worlds coming together. For people within the world of science doing a science degree, they saw becoming a science teacher as leaving that world of science in a way that they didn't always want to do. Yeah.
That's interesting because, of course, in Canada, there are additional qualification barriers as you move between states, even if you've qualified within Canada itself. So were they experiencing similar kinds of teacher shortage problems, or people being put off by Ontario turning them down, but Quebec saying okay?
Yeah, you're right. It's such a different and complex system there, and it's almost like each province is a different country, right? So I did my research in Quebec, and it very much had was facing teacher shortages, especially in science. And I know that Ontario does too. And anecdotally, and like reading and speaking with colleagues, I know that these things are happening across the provinces in Canada. But I think it's a newer problem, like teacher shortages are less ingrained there than they are here. But they seem to be something that are getting worse and worse, unfortunately. So it's important to understand why and how in the same ways that we're trying to do now. But they perhaps have the benefit of being earlier on in the problem. But because there is few people there, the same negative impact of having too few teachers could occur quite quickly, I think. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? I wonder, I don't know if we'd ever be able to look into this maybe in 10 years' time, but I wonder if the experience of young people now, as there are fewer and fewer qualified teachers teaching them their subjects in schools, might actually start to reverse this positive trend that you've already mentioned. I mean, if you're being constantly taught, let's say, for the sake of argument, biology by a nuclear physicist who's kind of really stretching to move out of their comfort zone within the subject, whether that would affect the student's view of what teaching might be like as a profession.
Yeah, I think that's a real risk too. I think that would be interesting to research in particular, because on one hand, subject-wise, I think it's a real risk and something that could undermine people's subject knowledge, subject expertise, subject love and passion. If that passion isn't there in your teacher, why would you become passionate about it? But on the other side, I know that some teachers are able to be great teachers across the board. So I don't think it would necessarily be definitely be a uniform pattern, that the increase we have in non-specialist teachers would definitely have that effect. But I think it has the potential to, especially at more advanced levels like A-level, I think that could have a real impact and would be worth exploring further, definitely.
Well, thanks for that, Emily. It's really surprising to hear that a third of young people between 10 and 22 were open to teaching as a career in your survey. And also to hear that vocation narrative returning. We see it quite often in, either advertising from the DFE to encourage people to go into classroom teaching. The kind of vocation idea is really kind of ramped up in the advertising you see, because often they don't have anything else to offer you in some senses. And it was also interesting to hear how that narrative came out in your study. It's evident that your research is giving us some fairly clear signals too, as you've suggested, that the profession should be looking to diversify its classroom workforce beyond perhaps the stereotypical image and the dominant truth, perhaps, as your research suggests, of the young white classroom female teacher. And perhaps we might explore in the final part of the show some suggestions as to how we might come closer to presenting a more diverse workforce in the classroom. We'll certainly take some time to reflect on what your findings might mean for developments in initial teacher training, public education about the profession, and the design of effective support and encouragement that aspiring teachers might need to help them prepare for a career in teaching. Does that sound like a good place for us to move the conversation on?
Sounds great. Thanks, Christopher.
Great. We'll be right back after this.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Reading Solutions UK. Are you looking for best practices and innovative strategies to foster confident, lifelong readers? Join the free online International Reading Conference on the 11th, 12th and 13th of June. Hear from speakers like TV personality and education expert Basit Siddiqui, beloved children's author Michael Rosen, fluency expert Tim Rosinski, EEF specialist Chloe Butlin, the National Literacy Trust's Irene Picton, and a range of experienced practitioners, including MATS leaders, deputy heads, heads of English, high-level teaching assistants, and school librarians. Through the 3-day conference, speakers will explore a range of topics at the forefront of the current educational landscape, with sessions relevant for all educators and key stages. Visit Reading Solutions at readingsolutionsuk.co.uk for more information and to sign up for this free conference.
Welcome back to the final part of our show on aspiring teachers and their experience of preparing for a career in the profession. So far, we've explored Emily's career in secondary languages teaching and her reasons for moving into the field of university education research. We've also looked closely at what Emily's research suggests attracts teachers to the classroom and some of the factors that might draw them away from it. In the final part of the show, then, I would like us to think about how we might encourage more graduates to consider teaching as a career and what preparation potential teachers might benefit from as they begin to consider a variety of training routes into the profession. So looking at the findings of your research, Emily, it's striking that so many of the young people you have studied ultimately built their careers in other professions. What encouragement and support do you think might have enabled them to become teachers beyond the financial that we've already explored?
Yeah, I think that there's two things. The first thing I would mention are these things called teaching type experiences that I touched upon earlier. And the second is awareness of teacher education and careers education about becoming a teacher. So in terms of the first point, this teaching type experiences. So there is research to suggest and kind of imply a link between people who have roles like that I mentioned earlier, being a sports coach, for example, a swimming teacher, or being a babysitter, or perhaps volunteering in your local school, or running, youth clubs and things like that. And that there is research to suggest that experiences like that can prompt people to want to become a teacher and become a teacher. And in fact, my research didn't suggest that, only in that the 10 people who didn't teach, many of them had experiences like this. I think it was 7 out of the 10 of them, which does imply what I would say, that these experiences are not teacher makers in themselves. However, I would still advocate for more young people to have the opportunity to, for example, volunteer with young people, because interestingly, as I mentioned, these young people who weren't teaching, it wasn't that they were dead against teaching. They hadn't turned away from it for the most part. And often these teaching type experiences help them to develop what I'd call a teacher identity. They kind of understood the role of teacher a bit better. They saw themselves being a teacher a little bit. They were treated a bit like a teacher in some of these roles. And surprise, surprise, being a teacher is a fun and enjoyable role. And they all enjoyed that. They didn't have negative experiences of it, even though sometimes it came with challenges. So I would say that offering more young people the chance to have teaching type experiences would have a positive effect on teacher recruitment. It's not that everyone would definitely become a teacher, but it's that we'd have more of an awareness amongst these young people of what a teacher is, and also a positive experience. And I think that more young people might become a teacher in that sense. But the second point that I mentioned was awareness of teacher education and careers education around becoming a teacher. So one of the striking findings from my research was that even though all of these young people had expressed an aspiration to teach, hardly any of their schools, colleges, and universities spoke to them about, do you know what it is to become a teacher, or how you can become a teacher? And in fact, only one of my participants, whilst they were on their university course, was spoken to about, did you know you can become a teacher using this degree, and this is how you might want to do it? Even though to become a teacher in England, most people do an undergraduate degree and then do postgraduate teacher education. So all of them could have gone on to specialise in education and become a teacher. None of their institutions were kind of recognising them as potential teachers. So I think that is key. I think that more education institutions need to just speak about the possibility of being a teacher. I think that we erroneously assume that young people know what it is to be a teacher and how to be a teacher, and that wasn't the case. They didn't always know that you have to do teacher education and what teacher education is. And the other thing I'd say is that at the time of writing, I found that there were 7 different routes to becoming a teacher. But I found that quite hard to research and find out. It was quite a messy landscape, and some of them come with funding, and some of them you have to pay for, and some of them you're a student, and some of them you count as a teacher. And it's just quite a difficult system to make sense of. So I would definitely advocate for more careers education around teaching, and perhaps more information about how you can become a teacher.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I don't think I'd be able to name the 7 routes into teaching for you. And I've been training PGCE students and NQTs for over 10 years. So just keeping all of these different routes in your head, even within the system itself, is quite a significant challenge. So if you come from outside the system to begin with, and you don't have any kind of family background in that system, that must be quite difficult. I remember talking to my mother about it, who was a teacher for much of her career. And we essentially decided that for me, it was the PGCE route was the best route in, because it balanced that kind of learning stuff in the university environment and that gradual experience of moving into the classroom. But that would be radically different from the kind of learn on the job schemes that we have essentially now and have developed over the last 4 or 5 years in the profession.
Yeah, and they're just ultimately they all give you qualified teacher status, these 7. And you're right, I'm not sure I could name it, but they include Schools Direct, Teach First, SCITS, and PGCEs, as well as BEds, the undergrad level. But it's messy, isn't it? And as you say, each one will offer a different thing for each person, and it's not that some are better than others, it's just that they're all different. And I think that coming back to my findings, each one will offer different levels of status and safety for different people. So some people, it will be perfectly safe for them to not be paid during the teacher education year. You know, they've got the family resources and that's fine. But other people would not be able to consider, especially after leaving university and being in a lot of debt, then taking on more debt to train to become a teacher. And I think that that's really important. And these things exist. There are a lot of routes into teaching, like partly because of these difficulties, but it's so complex, and I found it so difficult to like make sure that I knew how many there were and what each one offered. And the Get Into Teaching website is a great resource there, but I think that it's difficult to understand still how many there are and what each one will give you depending on your experience and what you want from the profession, especially if you're thinking of teaching as like, oh, will I, won't I? I've got this other thing in my mind as well. And I think that we need to shout about how great it can be. And also going back to that point about teaching being known as a vocation, if we embraced teacher education and the professional nature of it, perhaps that would help us like remove this notion that it's a vocation or that you can be a born teacher. It's great that you do teacher education to become a teacher in this country. Let's shout about it.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because we've got to strike a balance somewhere between the profession so that you get altruistic people involved in teaching, but also the idea that, you know, you're going to be trained properly to do the work of a professional and you're going to be given the status of a professional without it becoming a kind of attempt to replicate things that people think are successful in business.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah. I think it all comes down to just an awareness. Some of the participants I spoke to had this idea that you can become a teacher by being a teaching assistant, and then you can just like work there long enough, and then 1 September you'll be a teacher. And there are ways that you can work from becoming a teaching assistant to become a teacher, but there's education involved in that. And I think that, yeah, we really need to emphasize the skilled and professional nature of initial teacher education, because I'm not sure that that's done enough. And like you said, often advertising embraces the vocational aspect and the working with children aspect, and that's great, but my research suggests that young people know that and like that, and that's why they're thinking of teaching anyway. But we need to say, hey, it's a profession and you'll get really skilled experience and a qualification from people who like know what they're doing, and you don't need to be born to be a teacher. You don't need to be a born teacher. That's not a thing. You're going to learn how to become a teacher through specialized education.
Yeah, it is interesting. I can remember the advertising campaigns of the kind of late 2000s, 2006, 2007. And the posters you would see on London train station platforms would either conform to, this is how much you would get paid when you started, have you considered becoming a teacher? Or a picture of some child looking fairly upset. Jimmy's had a fairly distressing week this week. You'd be the person to cheer him up. And the sense of those two different narratives about what teaching involves is really quite difficult to reconcile with what the actual experience is on a day-to-day basis, because you are considered a professional by the vast majority of the people you meet. But you are engaged quite often in resolving some quite difficult pastoral issues, typically as you move through the upper end of secondary school and often in the very, very early years of primary education too. I wonder if there's a third way we can construct teaching as a profession so that we kind of move beyond those two extremes.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because I would argue of like that pastoral nature. You're right. We need to not ignore that. That's an important part of being a teacher. That that some people will know about or and like, and some people won't. But it is an important part. But it's also an important part of teacher education. People's PGCEs and etc. Will spend some time discussing like how to take on that pastoral role as a teacher. And you're absolutely right about that advertising. I remember the become a teacher and change your life advertising, and like you said, those ones that you're remembering were about the time that I was entering the profession, and they're not wrong. It's not that they're wrong, but my data indicates that young people know those things already. They know that you can help children, and they know that you could change your life, because everyone does often have that one teacher. It's like a cliche, but that one teacher that really influenced them or helps them go in one direction. So that's not the thing that we need to be focusing on. Like, let's not forget it, because it is important about being a teacher. But we also need to tell people the things that they don't seem to know, which is that the profession nature of it, the education nature of it, and how do you become a teacher nature of it. I think that that's the really important one. And again, just to repeat myself, but I think it's so important, like, we're not born teachers. I think that is something that needs to change. So, for example, if there was a DFE colleague like listening to the podcast, I would say we don't just need the adverts to have pictures of people in the classroom. We also need to have pictures of them or videos of them learning to teach in the university, for example, or in their lecture halls or in their seminar groups, and remind people about all the work that goes into before you get to the classroom. Yeah.
That's a really good
well.
point, actually, on teacher education. It is the big gap in the advertising campaigns that we've seen over the last 10 years or so. Of course, one of the other things you're not told about the profession is that you often need to produce quite a significant portfolio of data and analysis to move from M6 to UPS 1 on the pay scale. So there's these kind of hidden professional things that I don't actually remember featuring much on my teacher training course. At the time, I was doing my PGCE, because that was always something, 6, 7, 8 years in the future. And what you were focusing on was how to make sure you were good at your job on day one when you turned up to teach classes of children you'd never met before. What work do you think can be done then, Emily, to ensure that teacher education is respected, appreciated, and offers a realistic portrait of 21st century teaching?
I think we need more targeted careers education for young people that takes into account their own experiences, and that their experiences is different. I think this isn't an easy task for some, but we also need long-term careers education for young people. And we need careers education that emphasises the skilled and professional nature of ITE. And even though I think that this long-term and targeted career education is difficult to achieve, I think that one short fix is going into lecture theatres full of people who could be teachers, and my research indicates might be thinking about teaching as a second choice, and tell them, hey, did you know you could become a teacher with your degree? This is how you do it. And I think that that's one short fix. And the second thing is reminder of you can learn how to become a teacher through specialised education. You're not born one.
And quite a complex question, this one, potentially, to put on this late in the show, but do you think this will be helped or hindered by the recent government movement away from the idea of teaching as a graduate profession, the idea that you don't have to have a university degree to be a teacher?
Yeah, like the move to teacher apprenticeships. I think that I'm not quite sure how the two work. I'm not sure how we can get rid of the need for a degree to become a teacher, and also emphasize that teaching is this highly skilled profession, which I think is key. I don't think that they're necessarily completely against each other. I imagine it could be done, but I am reticent or reluctant about the push away from the need for university degree to become a teacher. Because if we need more people thinking it's a high status profession and one that you don't need to be born into, then let's celebrate the hard work and high level education that supports the profession.
And would you say that was a common view amongst your colleagues in teacher education?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Though, as I said, I think that it's often anecdotal because we don't have a lot of research with people who've turned away from teaching. My research was the first of tracking young people's trajectories towards and away from teaching. We're often reliant on what teachers say, and this is a bigger societal issue than that. This includes people who've never thought about becoming a teacher and people who occasionally think about it. So I think it needs a more linked up approach, and we need to include wider colleagues outside of education in these discussions too.
Did any of your young people in your study not move through a degree?
No, so one of them didn't at first. He decided not to become a teacher actually because he realized he would need a degree, and none of his family had started a degree, and he knew how expensive that would be, so he thought, oh no. And then he ended up working for 2 years, first in kind of like a state agency, and then in like water engineering. And then he suddenly realized, I think he learned somehow from some of his friends that actually you could get loans to go to university, and his chosen subject and passion was film. So he ended up studying film. So he was one of the ones that wasn't yet a teacher, but he seemed quite interested in teaching. But he was earlier on in his degree when I spoke to him than some of the others, because he'd had that experience of not going straight into his degree. So perhaps he's one that I should follow up with later. But most of them did, like most people do, go into higher education. Most people in my sample had, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's a really, really good exploration of some of those issues and some of the solutions that we might have in the future. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your research and your insights into Generation Z with us this evening. It's been really quite intriguing to hear about which preconceptions about school teaching still seem to shape the thinking of potential teachers, and the role these seemingly continue to play in drawing people into and away from the classroom. It's been fascinating too to hear about the similarities and parallels between your own experience of teacher training and an early classroom career and those of your research participants. So thank you very much for your contributions tonight and for finding the time to speak to us, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me, Christopher, and I especially appreciate it on a bank holiday weekend. Thanks so much.
Good to speak to you. Enjoy your bank holiday weekend.
Thank you, you too.
Good night. So, dear listener, we have reached the end of another Sunday Late Show. I hope you found this evening's show as informative as I did. Why did you become a teacher? What prompted you to go through the training, complete the various Byzantine paper or digital application forms, and to take on the often grueling job interview process? And what has prompted you to stay? Was it the same group of factors that drew you to the profession in the first place? Let us know by sending us your answers on Twitter. Thanks again to Dr. Emily McLeod for tonight's show, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in tonight. Do check out our other Teachers Talk radio shows this week. We have a number of new hosts continuing to make their debuts, so look up the schedule on the website and give them a listen if you can. I'm sure they'd appreciate your support and in-show text messages. You can hear Mary Greenhall talking to Emily Sharp tomorrow about supporting deaf pupils on the morning break show at 11 o'clock. An episode that promises to touch on important issues such as inclusion, managing teaching support, and the role of British Sign Language in the classroom. Alternatively, with the second round of public examinations still to come, you might want to catch up with Darren Lester's show on managing exam stress. Or Tom Hopkins Burke's show on the necessity of reading to open up the curriculum, because reading is never more important than when societies begin to marginalise it in favour of something else. This week and every week on Teachers Talk Radio, there is simply so much excellent content to engage with from real teachers working with real students in real schools. You can find anything you've missed on the 2,500 shows so far at www.ttradio.org. And if you have something you would like to say or ask others about education anywhere on planet Earth, then perhaps you should consider applying to join the station as a show host. We are always on the lookout for those with current or recent experience of the classroom and other less familiar educational settings. Full details can be found on our website, www.ttradio.org. That's all from me for this month. So thank you for listening. I wish you a restful half-term break if yours is about to start. And if you're off tomorrow, enjoy the weather. I hope it will be better than it has been today. And we will speak again in June. Goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.